If you were a Boy Scout or went to the Home Depot as a child, then chances are you've competed in a Pinewood Derby, a racing event where you're pitted against a bunch of other kids that you probably don't even know and armed with nothing but a block of wood, 4 wheels, and your imagination, as well as a Neanderthalic understanding of physics. I was in one when I was 5 years old, and I still have my Tony Stewart apron, my Tony Stewart car complete with a pile of dust, and my second place ribbon, which to the kid that beat me that day over 15 years ago, fuck you. If any of this rings a bell, then congratulations, you know what it's like to be a manufacturer in NASCAR, though it's not as simple as some might think. Every year the goal remains the same, to design a car that'll be the best and beat the rest. But it turns out that every little alteration, from the shape to the lining to the components on the car, can mean tenths, sometimes entire seconds worth of lap time. Engineers have known this for as long as they've been engineering, but it didn't really faze NASCAR until the late 1960s, when 2 automotive juggernauts went to war. Factory support was nothing new to NASCAR, as it was the Hudson Motor Car Company's involvement from 51 to 54 that inspired 108 victories and 3 championships. But as the sport ventured further into the future, manufacturer involvement increased steadily until 1966, when NASCAR was moving past the strictly stock era and Dodge introduced their new Charger, a performance car primarily characterized by its sloped rear windshield. They didn't necessarily have high-speed aspirations when they designed the car, but they sure would achieve them, as the Chargers would find victory lane in 18 of the 49 contests that year, the bulk of which belonged to David Pearson, who would take his first championship in the Cotton Owens Zone number 6. At this point, Ford had won the past 3 manufacturers' championships, and they still managed to win this one, but because of a huge loss in wins to both Dodge and Plymouth, who continued their reign with King Richard at the helm, the Blue Ovals were beginning to look vulnerable. After a 5th consecutive chip in '67, they would roll out 2 new models, the Ford Torino and the Mercury Cyclone, cars that would win 27 of the 49 races and give David Pearson his 2nd championship. As for Chrysler, they too had released a new car, the all-new 2nd-generation Dodge Charger, the car that would take the fight right to Ford's doorstep, if the goal was to lose as many races as possible. While it was a hit on the showroom floor, the enormous grille that spanned the entire nose of the car basically acted like a giant wall, pushing through the air like a snowplow on the interstate. It warranted a quick response, and respond they would, as in the fall of '68, Dodge unveiled their new Charger 500, an upgraded version of the previous with a pushed-up front grille and a rear-countered back windshield. At this point, it was obvious what they were doing. NASCAR had a homologation rule that required at least 500 cars be produced for the public, and while Ford continued their calling card of mass production, Dodge just barely met the minimum with their new Charger, with some sources saying they never even cleared 400. Nevertheless, the car would hit the track in '69, albeit to the quiet, disapproving gaze of NASCAR. They were moving beyond mere production cars, and seeing the writing on the wall, Ford was quick to break out the blueprints, where they came up with the Torino Talladega and the Cyclone spoiler. Now let's play a game. Can you spot the differences between these 2 cars? No? Well, that's because there aren't any. Besides the grille, headlights, and emblem on the front, they were built identically, both boasting a longer rounded front end and that trademark rear windshield. And with that, whether they knew it or not, they had just revolutionized the way race cars are built to this very day. The Aero Wars were officially underway. The first battle would take place on the beaches of Daytona, where Ford would stick it to their competitors by winning the 500 with Leroy Yarborough, narrowly beating the Cotton Owens number 6, now driven by Charlie Glotzback. The Blue Ovals would continue to dominate by winning 5 of the first 6 races and continuing to find victory lane all year long, at one point winning 11 races in a row. But most decisive of all, Richard Petty, now a 2-time champion, would jump ship to Ford, winning 9 races and finishing runner-up to David Pearson, also a Ford, who would take his 3rd and final championship. By this point, Dodge was getting fed up. They needed to respond once again, and they needed to do it yesterday. So later that season, they dropped the bomb. If the Charger 500 made a bang, then this was apocalyptic. It eviscerated every norm, standard, and convention that stock cars were known to have. It was the model to end all models, the amalgamation of racing's greatest designs. It was the Dodge Charger Daytona. Beyond looking like a rocket ship on wheels, it featured a perfectly sloped front end that formed an almost cone-like shape and a 23-inch wing that towered above it like a tiny bridge. It was the biggest, the baddest, and the most outlandish automobile that NASCAR had ever seen. And wouldn't you know it, its very first showing would come in the first race at the biggest, the baddest, and the most outlandish track that NASCAR had ever seen. It's pretty well documented just how much of a shit show this race turned out to be, but the long and short of it is that because of abrasive pavement, safety concerns forced a driver boycott that left only the fledgling Sportsman Division cars, Bobby Isaac, who was just kind of puttering hoping to have a good points day, Jim Vandiver driving the old Charger 500, and Richard Brickhouse driving the all-new Charger Daytona to run in the very first race at the Talladega Superspeedway. It was a hilariously bad showing with a rather dubious ending, as both of the top two finishers contested that they had won the race. With only 3 cars total finishing on the lead lap, one has to wonder how on God's green earth NASCAR fucked this up, but by their own calculations, not at all influenced by the fact that he was driving Chrysler's brand new $1 million baby, they would end up giving the win to Brickhouse, his first and what would turn out to be his only. By this point, the season was almost over, but this brand new sparkly space-agey marvel had given other manufacturers the utmost reason to prepare for next year, and the first to bite would be another Chrysler Corp brand. The task ahead was tall, but being under the same banner, Plymouth could use the same research and resources as Dodge, which they would do, and after an off-season of wind tunnels, test tracks, and allegedly government facilities, the racing world would be introduced to one of the most iconic cars in motorsports history, the second winged warrior, the Superbird. Now let's play this game again. What differences can you make out between these two cars? Right again, it's basically a one-for-one copy, but it must have had something going for it because it was enough to woo Richard Petty back in from Ford. Now armed with a fleet that literally loomed over the competition, Chrysler was finally ready to take the crown from Ford once and for all. After a rocky start in the first few races, the Birds would find their first taste of victory with Pete Hamilton in the Daytona 500, and from there they simply couldn't be stopped. Of the 48 races that season, Dodge and Plymouth combined to win 38 of them, including a 19-race stretch from early July to October. Of the top 10 points finishers, 7 of them were Chrysler Corp, and with their ludicrous speed on the big tracks, Dodge would end Ford's 7-year streak and finally win the Manufacturers' Championship. Hell, they even made history, holding numerous race and qualifying speed records and the big one. Buddy Baker, driving a Daytona at Atlanta, became the first NASCAR driver to go 200 miles per hour. The entire year was a resounding success for Chrysler, but as we know by now, their competitors weren't about to take this lying down. Ford had drafted their own warrior to send into the fray, one supposedly faster, more ferocious, and one that could fly through the field, the King Cobra. Like those before it, it was supposed to be a breakthrough, though unlike the Daytona and Superbird, the nose wasn't separate, the car sat lower, and it didn't have a 23-inch wing. In fact, it had no wing at all. Still, the company seemed to have faith in their new design, and the hype was palpable heading into the next season. But after a test at Daytona, NASCAR's president, Bill France, finally stepped in. He had entertained this battle in the interest of competition, but now things were getting out of hand. These weren't even stock cars anymore. They were science projects, and to put an end to it once and for all, he increased the homologation requirement from 500 to 3,000. And with a tire change and an engine handicap, it wasn't even worth it to run these kinds of cars anymore. As a result, among other reasons, Ford pulled out of NASCAR entirely, and although Plymouth would find success in a manufacturer's championship of their own, Chrysler Corp as a whole struggled, downsizing their factory support tenfold. 1971 could have been the greatest battle this war had ever seen, but instead it would see a return to normalcy. Instead of hosting Torinos, Cyclones, Daytonas, and Superbirds, some of the fastest cars ever made all racing on the same track, they were back to performance stock, even plucking some cars from the Grand Am series. Although the Winged Warrior would take 28 more accolades in the Bonneville Salt Flats, namely Bobby Isaac taking a flying mile at over 216 miles per hour, the powers that be had forced both sides to wave the white flag, forcing the end of the Aero War. But it's not that simple. Sure, the days of 8-foot hoods and sky-high spoilers are behind us, but as long as we try to make cars go fast, aerodynamics will always be in play. Through the 70s, the calling card stayed largely the same: enormous performance. That is until 1981, when NASCAR shortened the wheelbase and literally raised the roof. These changes initially caused concern, as the boxy nature of these cars rendered them far more ill-handling compared to their predecessors. But as the decade progressed, the designers would get more creative. Pointier noses, curved windshields, rounded cabs, déjà vu. And before they knew it, the sport was slipping right back to where it was less than 20 years ago, with the two big dogs, Ford and now GM, firing back and forth every single year. And it all came to a head in 1987, when Chevy had their Aero Coupe and Ford released the world's fastest race car, the Thunderbird. Just to give you a frame of reference, here's a pair of birds from just 10 years earlier. Some slight discrepancies in the chassis, but otherwise identical. Now here's that same car from '87. Yeah, not even close. With Bill Elliott at the helm, the T-Bird managed a 212-mile-per-hour qualifying lap at Talladega, a speed record that still stands for good reason, as while NASCAR sat back enjoying the age of speed, fate would give an eerie warning.
Oh, we have a problem. Bobby Allison with a horrible crash here on the front stretch. It has torn out a complete section of protective railing.
A small catch fence and a little bit of luck was all that separated NASCAR's fans from a 2-ton projectile in the form of Bobby Allison's 22. And with that, the message was made. The speeds had to come down. So once again, NASCAR stepped in, albeit with a much simpler addition, the restrictor plate. A small metal piece placed at the engine's air intake that limited horsepower and kept the field close. Now you might think this would disincentivize manufacturer involvement, but it actually did the opposite. With the race speeds capped, teams were looking for any and all advantages they could find on any other part of the car. And with the 4th generation of stock car came a slow and quiet return to battle. Showing all the subtle changes made from year to year would take quite a bit of time, so I'll just leave it at this. Here's a car at the beginning of Gen 4, and here's a car at the end, no longer bearing any similarity to stock. Though if you think that's bad, just wait till the next generation. The COT did a lot of things to NASCAR, and not a lot of them good, but by far one of its biggest sins was taking all manufacturer identity and throwing it out the window. At a time when the sport was already seeing a downturn in ratings, the Chevys, Fords, Toyotas, and Dodges suddenly had nothing setting them apart aside from their stickers, rendering them all virtually the same and undoing years of progression. When Big Bill split up the first Aero War, he did it with visions of a dystopian future, a future where all cars looked the same, and now, ironically, his grandson made that vision a reality, overseeing quite possibly the sharpest drop in popularity for any sport ever. Say what you will about Big Bill, but he really did know best. With the Gen 6 and next-gen cars, manufacturer identity has returned in some capacity, but is still limited by the strict rules regarding measurements and body templates. That doesn't mean the war is over per se, it's just gone a bit cold, as every few years manufacturers will put forth slightly different designs. The Camry in 2017, the Camaro in 2018, the Mustang in 2019, and this year, for the first time, there will be an alteration to the next gen. Ford's new Mustang Dark Horse, now boasting a longer, rounded front end. Where have I heard that before? It'll never be as fierce as it was in the 70s, but in a way, the Aero War will never truly end. And if this Mustang does well enough, who knows? As it always does in NASCAR, maybe history will come full circle, and the battle will commence once again.